In the space of a few turbulent hours, the fragile pause around Iran and the United States appeared to give way to something darker. Reports moved almost in real time. Iranian media claimed a United States Navy patrol boat had violated newly declared Iranian navigation rules in the Strait of Hormuz. Soon after, separate accounts described a burning cargo vessel off the coast of the United Arab Emirates and a major fire near Fujairah's port and petroleum industrial zone, with conflicting claims pointing to drones, cruise missiles, or both. The message attached to those events was unmistakable. Iranian officials, according to the discussion, were signaling that Washington's newly declared maritime mission amounted to a breach of the ceasefire framework. The central question was no longer whether tensions were rising, but whether the war had, in practical terms, already resumed. Larry Johnson's answer was direct. In his view, the war had indeed restarted, and what had preceded it was only a political maneuver. He argued that President Donald Trump's earlier declaration that the conflict was over had less to do with battlefield reality than with timing under the war powers framework. According to that interpretation, the key date was the end of the 60-day period after which Congress would be forced to vote on whether to authorize continuation of military action or demand withdrawal. Johnson claimed Trump tried to preempt that reckoning by announcing victory and closure, only to unveil a fresh mission roughly 36 hours later under a different name. In his telling, the label changed, but the military reality did not. That new label was Project Freedom, presented as an operation to establish freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. Johnson dismissed the concept as both legally suspect and strategically hollow. The troops, ships, and assets involved were already deployed, he noted. So rebranding the operation did not reset the legal clock or alter the fact of sustained involvement. From there, the conversation moved into the military logic of the Strait of Hormuz. Johnson argued that to truly open the strait by force, the United States would have to do far more than escort ships. It would have to remove or neutralize every threat capable of damaging commercial or naval traffic. Sea mines, underwater drones, submarines, surface drones, aerial drones, coastal defense, and cruise missiles, and short and intermediate range ballistic missiles. And that, he said, would mean something far larger than a naval patrol. It would require a major land campaign backed by substantial naval power and probably deep penetration into Iranian territory to seize or destroy dispersed launch sites hidden well inland. His estimate was stark. Forces would need to push roughly 150 to 200 miles into Iran at heavy cost to even begin making such a guarantee and credible. His conclusion was blunt. The strait would not be forced open by the United States under current conditions. In his view, the only durable way for shipping to move safely was if Iran itself chose to permit passage. Retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson approached the matter from another angle but reached a similar destination. He said he had heard from what he considered a somewhat credible source that Vice President J.D. Vance had privately questioned the logic of the new operation. Why, Wilkerson suggested Vance may have asked, would Washington declare an objective it plainly lacked the means to fulfill when some traffic had already been moving under an arrangement of Iranian oversight? In Wilkerson's reading, that lost opportunity mattered. A practical, if imperfect, situation in the strait might have been used as the basis for serious talks. Instead, he said, the United States chose a public posture that risked immediate humiliation, a deeper shock to the global economy, and a fresh oil price surge if Iran decided to fully obstruct traffic. The discussion then widened beyond the strait itself. The host pressed the point that, unlike previous episodes in which Washington or Israel made the first move, this time Iran seemed to be acting quickly and publicly in response to what it viewed as violations. What did that say about Iran's confidence and about the broader balance now taking shape? Johnson insisted that even here, Iran was still reacting rather than initiating. He argued that the United States had effectively imposed a blockade and had illegally boarded ships in international waters, acts he described as piracy. In his account, Iran's latest actions were retaliation coupled with a challenge. If Washington wanted to keep escalating, Tehran was prepared to climb the escalation ladder. That led to one of the more significant themes of the exchange: who actually held leverage. Johnson argued that Iran, not the United States, held the better cards in this confrontation. He accused Washington of operating under severe intelligence distortions, relying too heavily on Israeli assessments that portrayed Iran's leadership as divided, confused, and unstable. He rejected that portrait entirely. To him, the defining feature of Iran's current leadership was not disarray, but shared formation in war. He pointed to figures such as President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Arakchi, parliamentary leaders, and the supreme leadership sphere as men shaped by the Iran-Iraq War and, in many cases, by connections to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. His point was not that they had all served side by side in identical roles. It was that war creates bonds among elites that civilian politics rarely can. In his view, Iran's leadership today is unusually cohesive precisely because so many of its key figures emerged from the same formative national trauma. Wilkerson reinforced that argument with a different example. He cited commentary from John Mearsheimer, who had reportedly dismissed the idea that economic pressure alone would crack Iranian resolves. Inflation, sanctions, shortages, and financial pain, Wilkerson argued, mattered far less when a society believed it was facing an existential threat. That phrase, existential threat, hung over the entire conversation. For Wilkerson, Iran's ruling class does not interpret current pressure as ordinary diplomacy or routine coercion. It sees a continuation of decades of confrontation, intensified by Israeli action and by periodic American pressure, and responds through that lens of survival. From there, attention shifted to battlefield claims and the information war surrounding them. The host raised reports that the United States said it had destroyed 6 Iranian fast boats during the maritime exchange. Johnson answered with sarcasm, suggesting that if one believed earlier official claims that Iran's military capabilities had already been devastated, such new announcements became difficult to reconcile. He argued that Washington had been conducting a broad propaganda effort aimed less at deceiving adversaries than at reassuring the American public. In his assessment, the Pentagon and United States Central Command had repeatedly downplayed losses, denied successful Iranian strikes, and offered implausible explanations for incidents involving American platforms and facilities. He cited several examples from the broader conflict narrative: denials about drones or missiles hitting major naval assets, stories about shipboard fires, and unclear explanations for damage to destroyers and systems. To Johnson, these accounts resembled wartime myth-making rather than transparent military reporting. The public story, he implied, was increasingly detached from operational reality. His core test was simple: could a United States destroyer or cruiser transit the Strait of Hormuz effortlessly under current conditions without unacceptable risk? Johnson's answer was no, and he said the next few days would reveal whether official confidence was justified or not. The conversation briefly touched on language as a symbol of policy confusion. Trump had referred to the Arabian Gulf, a phrase long contested by those who insist on the historical term Persian Gulf. Wilkerson seized on that as a small but revealing example of how superficial politics and regional favoritism had often displaced strategic seriousness in Washington's handling of the Middle East. He returned again to first principles. The only way to achieve what Trump was publicly promising, Wilkerson said, would be to land large forces in Iran and fight through the country. Since no serious planner could welcome the enormous casualties and political consequences of such a move, the rhetoric and the actual means available were dangerously disconnected. That, he suggested, was part of why Trump appeared trapped. According to Wilkerson, the president wanted out of the crisis, but did not know how to leave without appearing weak. Worse, every attempt to appear tougher seemed to deepen the strategic and political hole. In Wilkerson's account, this trap could not be understood without Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. He argued that Trump had been drawn into a broader regional mess he did not fully control. At the same time, Netanyahu's own conduct in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond was, in Wilkerson's view, steadily making the crisis harder for Washington to contain. When the host introduced reports that new United States and Israeli strikes on Iran might be planned within the next day, Johnson said the target packages had likely already been prepared. The plans existed, he suggested. The unresolved question was not capability in the abstract, but whether decision-makers fully appreciated how much Iran had adapted. Johnson claimed Iran had recently carried out 2 major live-fire tests of upgraded air defense systems. To him, those exercises suggested that Tehran had introduced new capabilities that could make attacks over the Gulf more costly than expected. He warned that Iranian retaliation against Israel and against United States bases had not yet reached its full form. He also referenced repeated Iranian hints that a new surprise remained in reserve. He admitted he did not know what that meant, but he took the warning seriously because, in his view, Iran had so far been disciplined rather than exhausted. That was his broader message. Tehran still had escalation capacity left. As the discussion turned to economics, the tone grew more ominous. Johnson argued that the administration was underestimating the scale of the economic shock already in motion. He listed not only oil, but also disruptions involving fertilizer inputs, liquefied natural gas, helium, sulfuric acid, and other strategic commodities whose supply chains could not be quickly replaced. His central image was that of a tsunami. At first, the shoreline empties and the exposed seabed can seem deceptively calm, even inviting. But that retreat is the warning sign. The destructive force arrives later, and when it does, it hits with accumulated momentum. He argued that the initial closure and disruption around the strait had not produced instant pain everywhere, because ships already at sea continued to deliver existing cargoes, but once those floating inventories ran out, shortages and price spikes would begin to move through everyday life. In his telling, that delayed wave was now arriving. He pointed to gasoline prices as one of the earliest visible signs. In his account, prices in his area had jumped sharply within days, with similar or worse increases in other regions, especially on the West Coast and in parts of the Midwest. The host added examples from California and New York, where retail fuel prices were visibly rising from one day to the next. Johnson's argument went further than a normal oil shock. He claimed that even benchmark and futures markets had not honestly reflected the underlying scarcity, calling much of the pricing narrative a form of paper market distortion. The real cost of physical supply, he suggested, was already far above the story presented to the public. So why keep going? The host asked. If the costs were mounting, the battlefield options were poor, and the political environment was deteriorating, why strike now? Why escalate now? Wilkerson answered through Netanyahu. He described the Israeli prime minister as a man running off a cliff and hanging in midair, sustained only by momentum and denial. In Lebanon, he said, Israel was paying a growing price in equipment, morale, and manpower while making too little operational progress. Citing contacts who still followed the Israeli military closely, Wilkerson said official casualty figures should be treated with skepticism. In his retelling, the burden on the force was broader than battlefield deaths alone. It included psychological strain, post-traumatic stress, suicide, exhaustion, and declining confidence inside units repeatedly pushed into conflict. He also argued that Israeli authorities were obscuring the extent of damage inflicted inside Israel by Iranian strikes. If hostilities resumed at scale, he warned, Iran would likely return to that pattern and intensify it. And in Wilkerson's stark assessment, if Israel and the United States resumed bombing Iran, Tehran's next round of responses would probably come harder than before. Johnson then tied military strain directly to financial strain inside the United States. He spoke of mounting national debt, the rapidly rising costs of operations, and the extraordinary expense of replacing or attempting to replace lost or degraded weapon systems. Aircraft losses, damaged bases, radar systems, missile defenses, and high-end strike weapons all carried price tags that accumulated fast. He singled out the broader problem of industrial depletion. In his view, the United States had already consumed critical stocks of important munitions and air defense interceptors at a rate its own manufacturing base could not quickly sustain. More importantly, he argued, replacement was constrained by dependence on rare earths and other components tied to Chinese supply chains. That point became one of the most consequential in the discussion. If China controls key materials, and China is no longer willing to accommodate Washington on strategic grounds, then rearmament itself becomes slower, more expensive, and less certain. For Johnson, this was not a future scenario, it was a present vulnerability. He claimed official figures on remaining missile inventories, especially Patriot interceptors, were deeply misleading. His argument was built on production totals, foreign military sales, transfers to Ukraine, and the high interception ratios required against incoming threats. Once those factors were considered, he said, the available stockpile for a major campaign looked dangerously thin. The implication was unsettling. If Iran could sustain very high launch volumes with missiles, drones, or mixed salvos, then the arithmetic of defense might fail long before the rhetoric of resilience did. Johnson's conclusion was that the math simply did not support the confidence being projected. Then came another burst of presidential messaging. Trump posted that everything remained fully operational on the American side, while Iran had been completely destroyed, and he floated the possibility that South Korea should join the mission. After what he described as Iranian attacks affecting shipping, he also announced the coming press conference by senior defense officials. Wilkerson dismissed the appeal for Allied help as a sign of isolation. In his reading, the war was already widely understood abroad as a voluntary, unnecessary, and strategically foolish conflict, one associated not with collective security but with Netanyahu's agenda, but he doubted any major ally would want to become entangled in such a mission. He then widened the frame dramatically. If the United States and Israel resumed bombing, he argued, they would find themselves even more isolated on the world stage than before. Countries might not all embrace Iran, but many would recoil from Washington's course, and that diplomatic distance would matter. At home, Wilkerson saw another danger. He believed the economic effects of the crisis could push the United States beyond recession toward something more severe. And in that domestic atmosphere, he worried that political stress could produce extraordinary measures, from intensified internal security tactics to aggressive manipulation of electoral processes. The discussion touched on polling, with the host noting that Trump's approval ratings had deteriorated since the conflict flared. Wilkerson said the congressional hearings, particularly those involving Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, suggested discomfort that crossed party lines. Even Republicans, he argued, seemed to be searching for a coherent rationale and not finding one. If the war had been expected to distract from other political liabilities, Wilkerson said, it might instead become the larger liability. Voters can absorb scandal, he implied, but they do not ignore pressure on their wallets forever. Once household costs rise sharply, anger becomes harder to redirect. Attention then shifted to China, and here the tone changed from tactical to civilizational. Johnson argued that the United States now lacked obvious economic leverage over Beijing. There were products China might still choose to buy from America, he said, but few that it absolutely needed and could not source elsewhere. The reverse in his telling was not true. The United States remained dependent on China for key industrial inputs, components, magnets, minerals, and manufactured goods essential to advanced sectors. That asymmetry, he argued, gave Beijing real leverage as the geopolitical contest intensified. He also described an aggressive Iranian information campaign, one that used memes, parody videos, music clips, and digital mockery to shape perception. Though colorful, his point was serious. Iran, in his view, was not only fighting with missiles and policy statements, it was competing effectively in the realm of attention, humiliation, and narrative. Wilkerson returned to a larger strategic conclusion. The United States and Israel, he argued, were becoming increasingly alone, while China and Russia were sending unmistakable signals of support to Iran, even if in different forms and with different limits. That did not mean a formal bloc was marching to war. It meant the old assumption of effortless United States coercive dominance no longer held. This is where the conversation began to sound less like commentary on one crisis and more like a diagnosis of an era. The host raised the idea of imperial decline, noting that even mainstream American outlets had begun discussing it more openly. Was this confrontation another symptom of that deeper process? Wilkerson's answer focused on state capacity. He said the absurdity of publicly promising to secure the strait without enough ships, enough operational flexibility, or enough strategic coherence was itself revealing. A great power in assent does not usually advertise commitments it plainly cannot fulfill. He connected that weakness to a long-running criticism of the American military-industrial system. In his view, the United States had become a contractor-heavy power that often produced overpriced systems of uneven quality, while relying on political messaging to paper over the gap between cost and performance. The result, he suggested, was not sustainable supremacy, but hollowed-out strength. Johnson pushed the decline thesis further. He said the signs were visible not only in military overreach, but also in global finance and diplomacy. Rather than lining up to hold United States dollars and treasury bills with confidence, many actors were now looking for exits, alternatives, and hedges. He singled out China's recent posture as especially remarkable. According to him, Beijing had effectively instructed its financial system and industrial players not to bend to Washington's sanctions. The pressure on Iran. For Johnson, that was not a routine diplomatic disagreement. It was a sign of deep irritation and of increasing willingness to challenge American financial coercion directly. He also noted Germany's mixed posture on the question of American troop reductions. Berlin might object rhetorically to hasty changes, but the continued presence of United States bases also had an economic logic for Germany. Even there, he implied, the old architecture persisted partly because of local dependence and inertia, not because of clear strategic necessity. The larger picture, as both men painted it, was one of systems under strain. American power remained formidable, but it was no longer translating cleanly into desired outcomes. Military operations generated new costs, sanctions generated workarounds, alliances generated hesitation, public messaging generated skepticism. The host's closing reflection captured that mood. Some still believed control over oil routes or energy choke points could preserve United States dominance by force of habit. But if China, Russia, Iran, and other states were increasingly prepared to organize outside that pressure, then coercion might accelerate the very realignments it was meant to stop. That was the haunting possibility at the center of the discussion. Every new act of pressure, every new sanction, every new attempt to tighten control could produce the opposite result. More resistance, more alternative networks, more erosion of confidence in the American-led order. In that sense, The crisis in the Gulf was not just about one waterway. It was about the collision between military theater and strategic reality. It was about whether power can still command obedience when its costs are rising, its narratives are fraying, and its adversaries are learning faster than expected. It was about whether a superpower can still impose order when the rest of the world is already adapting to life beyond its uncontested reach. And that leaves the final question hanging, unresolved and urgent. Is this merely another dangerous chapter in a long cycle of Middle Eastern confrontation, or is it something larger, a historic threshold where the language of dominance no longer matches the balance of power beneath it? Watch closely, because what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz may say as much about the future of the world order as it does about the war itself. What do you think happens if Washington and Tel Aviv press forward again? Does deterrence still work, or has the strategic center of gravity already shifted? Share your view, follow the story closely, and stay with us, because this may mark not a pause in the crisis, but a turning point in the age that produced it.